The night wind cut cold through San Francisco's streets, carrying the smell of sea salt and disappointment. James Miller pressed his forehead to the icy window of his tiny apartment, watching the city lights that once promised to be his. Now they only reminded him how many others out there were living the dream he had woken from. His laptop blinked on the table, the screen crowded with unanswered emails, creditors, former colleagues, opportunities that had curdled into failures. Every notification was a small cut, a reminder that his once promising AI startup had become nothing more than a line in a tech obituary. He opened the nearly empty fridge, eyeing a packet of instant noodles like a condemned man's final meal. Bills piled on the table, late rent, student loans, maxed out credit cards. The apartment's silence broke only for the low hum of a faulty refrigerator and the distant wail of sirens. James felt the familiar weight of loneliness, that constant companion whispering he wasn't good enough, that maybe he never would be. His mind drifted back to years ago, when he'd arrived in San Francisco full of ambition, sure that one brilliant idea and hard work would be enough. Older now, and tired, he understood success was an equation of timing, luck, and connections, three things that always seemed to slip through his fingers. He picked up a dusty photo from the shelf, him and his team on launch day, all big smiles and eyes full of future. Where were they now? Probably in stable jobs, moving on, while James stayed stuck in the past, sifting through the wreckage of his own unrealized potential. Tired of staring at the four walls that had witnessed his decline, James decided to go for a night walk. Fresh air might clear his head, or at least delay a few hours of the reality waiting at home. He went down the building's stairs, passing doors behind which other lives were unfolding, muffled laughter, the smell of dinner, the normalcy he envied. The park was almost empty at that hour, lit by lampposts that threw long, warped shadows across the stone path. Hands in his pockets, James walked as his breath bloomed white in the cold air. That's when he saw the figure collapse near a bench, an older man in an expensive coat, now crumpled against the ground. James hesitated. In a city full of crises, indifference was a survival mechanism. But something about the man's posture, a dignity even in vulnerability, pulled him closer. The old man was conscious, but barely. Pain glazed his eyes, one hand pressed to his chest. He murmured something unintelligible, trembling fingers clawing at his coat. James knelt beside him, his own heart racing. He had no medical training, didn't know what to do, but he knew he couldn't just walk away. He slipped off his jacket and tucked it beneath the man's head, trying to keep him warm while fumbling for his phone to call an ambulance. As he dialed, James noticed details: the man's thin, elegant watch, imported leather shoes, a bearing that, even in agony, spoke of a life spent in authority. This wasn't a homeless stranger, not an ordinary passerby. There was a story here, a complex and likely important life, now reduced to a moment of fragility beneath San Francisco's cold stars. The ambulance arrived quickly, blue lights pulsing against the trees. As the paramedics took over, one turned to James. "Do you know this man?" James shook his head. "No, I just was walking by." The paramedic nodded. "He's lucky you were here. Others might have kept moving." When the ambulance pulled away, taking the older man to the hospital, one of the paramedics handed James a business card they'd found in the man's pocket. Simple. Elegant. Embossed with just a name and number, Arthur Pendleton. James stood in the park, card between his fingers, the night's cold suddenly deeper. Something in that chance encounter, an unexpected moment of human connection, had opened a crack in his darkness. He didn't know it yet, but that night would mark the end of one life and the beginning of another, not just for Arthur Pendleton, but for himself. Morning brought the same gray reality, but something had shifted inside James. Arthur Pendleton's card lay on his coffee table, a small rectangle of paper that seemed to thrum with unspoken promises. James traced the embossed name, imagining the life behind that discreet elegance. Would it be foolish to call? Maybe the billionaire had already forgotten the incident, swallowed by important matters. Or worse, maybe he'd see James as an opportunist, a man who saved a life only to cash it in. The thoughts circled as he made coffee, the bitterness mirroring his mood. His phone buzzed, making him jump. The landlord, voice sharp as a blade. "Miller, you've got until Friday to pay the overdue rent, or I'll have to take action." James promised, knowing he couldn't deliver. He hung up and stared at the card again. Temptation tugged, but fear of rejection pinned him in place. He decided to head out, to chase air and maybe clarity. The streets were alive with daytime energy, executives in a hurry gripping artisan coffee, tourists marveling at architecture, everyone wrapped in their own stories. James felt invisible, a ghost in a world that had moved on without him. On his way home, his phone rang again. Unknown number. He answered cautiously. "James Miller?" A woman's voice, soft but steady. "Yes. My name is Eleanor. I work for Mr. Pendleton. He would like to see you. Can you come to St. Matthew's Hospital this afternoon?" James's heart kicked. He agreed without asking for details. When he hung up, relief and anxiety braided together. At least he hadn't had to make the hard call. The hospital was a maze of white corridors and antiseptic air. James followed directions to a private room, where Arthur Pendleton sat on the bed, paler than the night before, but with sharp, alert eyes. "James," Arthur said, voice weak yet authoritative. "Thank you for coming." He gestured to a chair. James sat, feeling out of place in the sterile, luxurious quiet. "How are you, sir?" Arthur's smile was slight. "Arthur, please. And I'm alive, thanks to you. That's more than I could ask." They chatted for a few minutes, weather, the city, but Arthur skirted his health and the incident in the park. Finally, he leaned forward, expression sober. "James, you did me an invaluable kindness. I believe in repaying kindness with kindness." He paused, studying James's face. "I know you've had a rough time. Your startup, the AI, was promising." "I heard." James blinked. How did he know? He hadn't shared anything. "Don't worry," Arthur went on. "I have my ways. The point is, I can offer you an opportunity. But it comes with risks." Arthur explained that he'd founded a tech company, Pendleton Innovations, but had stepped back from day-to-day control in recent years. The board, led by Victoria Sterling, was pushing for changes, and Arthur distrusted their intentions. "They think I'm old, sick, unfit to lead," he said, a spark of anger in his eyes. "But I still have cards to play." James listened, fascinated, uneasy. He was being drawn into a corporate conflict he knew nothing about, but the hint of an opportunity was too tempting to ignore. Before James could respond, the door opened and a woman stepped in, Victoria Sterling. impeccably dressed in a gray suit that screamed power, with a smile sharp as glass. "Arthur, dear, we heard about your incident. We're all terribly concerned." Her gaze found James, assessing, disdainful. "And you must be the Good Samaritan. James Miller, right? The founder of that failed startup." He prickled at James's neck, but he kept his composure. "Yes, that's me." Victoria turned to Arthur. "We need to discuss the board meeting. Decisions to be made." Arthur replied calmly, firmly. "All in due time, Victoria. James, thank you for coming. Eleanor will follow up." James left the room, mind spinning. He'd been pulled onto a chessboard with pieces he didn't recognize. In the hallway, Eleanor waited with an envelope. "Mr. Pendleton would like you to read this at home," she said softly. James took it, feeling the symbolic weight. Stepping out into daylight, the sun seemed brighter, but a shadow of uncertainty trailed him. What was in that envelope? A job offer? A check? Or something more dangerous? He didn't know, but every step back to his apartment carried a new hope, and an old fear that hope might be his undoing. James returned to his apartment with the envelope heavy in his hands, as if it contained secrets capable of bending the course of his life. The air inside felt thicker now, dense with possibility and invisible danger. He sat at the table, staring at the simple object that could be a lifeline or a well-laid trap. His hands trembled as he opened it. He drew a long breath, trying to slow the storm of thoughts. Inside, a dense document bristling with legal clauses, and a handwritten letter from Arthur Pendleton. The script was firm, elegant, like the man himself. The letter began with sincere thanks for the rescue in the park, then plunged quickly into serious matters. Given his health and internal pressures at the company, Arthur needed someone he could trust for a delicate mission. He didn't spell out specifics, but made it clear James was being invited into a temporary consulting role, with generous compensation that would immediately wipe out his debts. But there was a warning: accepting meant stepping into a minefield of corporate interests, where loyalties were volatile and risks high. James read and reread, a mix of euphoria and dread rising in his chest. It was an answer to desperate prayer, attached to a price he couldn't yet see. As he waited, his phone rang again. Another creditor, this one threatening legal action over a credit card debt. The collector's rough voice hammered urgency into his ears. James hung up and looked at the letter again. Not many options: keep sinking into debt and despair, or accept Arthur's offer and dive into a world he didn't know. The decision seemed obvious, but a chill down his spine warned of hidden traps. He decided he needed more information before committing. The next day, he met Eleanor at a discreet cafe downtown. She was as polished and reserved as at the hospital, dressed in professional neutrality that made her invisible among executives. "Mr. Pendleton values your discretion," she said, sipping tea. "He believes you have integrity, and that's what we need." She explained that Arthur faced a subtle effort to push him out of Pendleton Innovations. Victoria Sterling and other board members were using his fragile health to justify leadership changes, but Arthur suspected darker motives, diverted funds and questionable deals. James listened closely, absorbing each detail. He felt out of his depth, a failed founder in the middle of a billion-dollar corporate war. Yet something in Arthur's story resonated: the fight for agency, the fear of betrayal by people you trust. feelings James knew, if on a smaller scale. Eleanor handed him an encrypted device with instructions to access confidential company documents. "Study this," she said. "Mr. Pendleton wants you to understand before you decide. But time matters. The board meeting is in 3 days, and crucial decisions are coming." Back home, James dove into the files. Financial reports, internal emails, meeting minutes, together painting a complex picture of fault lines at Pendleton Innovations. He found Victoria and her allies pushing a merger with a rival, a move that would enrich a few at the cost of thousands of jobs in Arthur's original vision. The more he read, the more he believed Arthur was right to be wary. He also felt the danger. The information was volatile. In the wrong hands, it could wreck careers and trigger criminal charges. That night, sleep barely touched him. Scenarios looped in his head. What if he accepted and got caught? What if he refused and lost his last chance to rebuild? He rose and went to the window, watching a city half asleep. The flickering lights whispered promises of a better future, and warnings about the shadows beneath. He couldn't stay in limbo. Life had pushed him to a crossroads. He had to choose. By morning, he had. He called Eleanor and accepted, on the condition that his role be clearly defined and that he'd have access to everything needed. Eleanor agreed and set a meeting with Arthur at Pendleton Innovations headquarters for late afternoon. James put on his best suit, the one he hadn't worn since his startup's bright days, and left with a renewed resolve. Still, the tower that held the company churned his stomach. A symbol of power and success, everything he had lost, everything he hoped to reclaim. In the lavish lobby, Eleanor met him and led him to a private elevator. "Mr. Pendleton is expecting you," she said, voice calm, eyes alert. When the doors opened, a silent corridor stretched ahead, lined with modern art that spoke of wealth and influence. She guided him into a wide office where Arthur sat behind a heavy wooden desk, eyes on a screen of financial data. "James," Arthur said, looking up and gesturing to a chair. "I'm glad you accepted. We have work." Arthur laid out the plan. James would be his eyes and ears inside the company, sitting in on meetings, reporting anything suspicious. A role of trust and vulnerability. No formal authority. He'd have to move carefully among the board members. As Arthur detailed the steps, the door opened and Victoria Sterling walked in. Her face tightened the instant she saw James. "Arthur, I wasn't told we'd have company," she said, voice cool. "James Miller is now my personal consultant," Arthur replied without hesitation. "He'll help review some projects." Victoria forced a smile, eyes sparking with restrained fury. "How interesting. I hope he's equal to the challenge." When she left, Arthur turned back, grave. "She didn't like your presence. That means we're on the right track. But brace yourself, James. Things are going to get hard." James nodded, the weight of responsibility pressing down. He'd taken the first step onto a dangerous road. No turning back. As he left the office, he couldn't help wondering what waited ahead, and whether he had the strength to meet it. One thing was certain, his life would never be the same. James left Arthur's office with the sense that he'd crossed into hostile territory where every step had to be clockwork precise. The gleaming lobby of Pendleton Innovations now felt like a silent battlefield, with hurried employees casting quick, curious looks his way. He headed to the elevator, replaying Arthur's words, and the ice in Victoria's stare. As he tapped the button, he noticed his palms were damp. The doors sealed. The car slid down quietly. James felt like he was falling into an abyss of uncertainty. In the lobby, Eleanor waited with a tablet, face as unreadable as ever. "We need to discuss your first task," she said, steering him to a side conference room. Frosted glass promised privacy. James still felt exposed, like the whole company was watching. Eleanor explained he had to review reports for a recent project called the Atlas Initiative, Victoria's fiercely championed expansion into international markets. "Arthur believes there are inconsistencies," she murmured, lowering her voice. "He wants you to analyze the data and flag anomalies before the board meeting." A chill ran through him. He wasn't an accountant, but startup life had taught him how to read numbers. Diving into Pendleton Innovations documents, though, was like swimming in an ocean of figures with sharks circling below. He spent hours buried in spreadsheets and reports, concentration broken only by the HVAC's low drone. Lines of data turned into puzzles, and patterns began to emerge: unexplained expenses, transfers to offshore accounts, growth projections that felt wildly optimistic. He spotted something others might miss: a chain of repeated transactions that didn't align with the stated strategy. As he worked, a text flashed from an unknown number: "Watch your step. Some paths are slicker than others." James froze, pulse thudding. A warning? A threat? He looked around. The room was empty. He kept it to himself for now, not wanting to sound paranoid. Instead, he doubled down, determined to prove his value. Late afternoon, he was summoned to a team meeting on the 10th floor. A large room, dark wood conference table, view of the bay like a painting. Victoria at the head, flanked by two executives he recognized from hallway portraits: Marcus Thorne, CFO, and Sarah Lee, head of operations. James sat quietly in a corner, feeling like an intruder. Victoria opened with an Atlas update, voice confident, enthusiasm carefully measured. She praised progress and touted benefits, sidestepping the discrepancies he'd found. When she opened the floor, James raised his hand, voice shaky at first. "Apologies for the interruption, but I noticed inconsistencies in the project expense reports. There are recurring transactions to an entity called Horizon Consulting that isn't on the approved vendor list." Silence thickened. Victoria's look could have frozen lava. Marcus adjusted his glasses, uncomfortable. "Those transactions are confidential," Victoria said flatly. "They involve strategic partnerships that can't be broadly disclosed." James didn't back down. A spark he hadn't felt since his startup days flickered to life. "Understood. But for transparency, perhaps we could review those partnerships in the appropriate forum. The board expects full clarity before approving additional funds." His words were gentle, the message was not. Sarah Lee stepped in, voice soft but steady. "James has a point. We can schedule a due diligence session to clarify." Victoria nodded, reluctant, eyes promising payback. James knew he'd made a powerful enemy, and maybe a quiet ally in Sarah. After the meeting, Sarah approached in the corridor. "You've got nerve," she said, lowering her voice. "Be careful. Victoria doesn't forgive easily." James thanked her and returned to his temporary office, a small room with a view of neighboring towers. A package sat on his desk. Plain box. No sender. Inside, a flash drive and an anonymous note. There's more behind Atlas. Look for hidden files. His hands trembled plugging it in. The drive held documents outside official systems, deleted emails, recorded conversations, draft contracts pointing to a siphoning scheme involving Victoria and Marcus. Overwhelmed, he weighed his next move. The information could end careers and trigger criminal charges. It also confirmed Arthur's suspicions. Who to trust? Eleanor? Arthur? Confront Victoria? His phone rang. Arthur. We need to meet. Something urgent. Arthur's voice was taut, unlike his usual calm. James agreed to a late after-hours cafe, far from curious eyes. Leaving the building, James felt watched. He turned, only the usual evening crowd. Paranoia fed by discoveries and veiled threats. At the cafe, Arthur waited in a back booth, worry etched in his face. James, I've heard Victoria plans to move against us before the board meeting. She might try to discredit you, or worse. Arthur handed over an envelope with backup documents and trusted contacts inside the company. Use this wisely. And James, trust few. That night at home, he pored over the flash drive and Arthur's papers, pieces of a dangerous puzzle. He connected dots between suspect transfers and damning emails. The more he found, the clearer it became. Victoria and her allies weren't just jostling for power. They were running a network of corruption that threatened Pendleton Innovations itself. At dawn, James made a decision. He'd go into the board meeting armed with the truth, whatever the cost. Then his phone buzzed again, Victoria's message, "We need to talk. Meet me at the office, now." Urgent. Almost menacing. The reckoning was coming. He would either retreat, or fight for what was right. A knot of anxiety tightened in James's stomach as he read Victoria's message. No room for negotiation. He glanced at the documents spread across his desk. The proof he'd collected on the Atlas initiative now felt heavy as stones, each one a calculated risk. He breathed in, remembering he'd stepped into this out of necessity, but also because something in him had flickered back to life, a sense of justice. He slipped the flash drive and the most sensitive pages into a plain folder, locking it in his drawer before heading to Victoria's office. The corridor was quiet, late afternoon light casting long shadows that seemed to whisper warnings. Victoria stood at the window when he entered, the skyline at her back. She turned slowly, her face a mask of professional poise, eyes glittering cold. "James, thank you for coming," she said, gesturing to a chair. "Sit." He did, feeling like a defendant in open court. She took her place behind the desk, fingers interlaced. "I've heard interesting things about your recent work. Seems you're wading into matters you don't fully understand." "I'm just doing what Arthur asked," James said, voice even. "Reviewing projects like Atlas is part of that." Victoria's smile was empty, never reaching her eyes. Arthur is a visionary, but his health keeps him from seeing business reality. Atlas is essential to this company's future. Any inconsistencies you think you found are misunderstandings by someone still learning how we operate. She leaned in, lowering her voice. "You're talented, James. You could have a future here, far from Arthur's intrigues. But to get there, you need to know when to step back." Pressure coiled in the room. She was offering a way out, drop the investigation in exchange for safety and a career. Tempting, given his debts and fear of failure. But he remembered Arthur's honesty, the gratitude in the old man's eyes in the park, and his own instinct to save a life without thinking. "I appreciate the offer," he said. "But transparency serves everyone. If there are misunderstandings, let's clear them openly before the board." Victoria's face hardened. She rose, circling the desk like a predator measuring prey. "Very well. If you insist on swimming in deep waters, understand there are currents that drag. The board meets in 2 days. I'm sure your findings will be properly contextualized." The threat was wrapped in silk. James understood. She wouldn't back off. He nodded curtly and left, feeling her gaze burn between his shoulders. Back at his office, Sara Lee waited. Serious, door closing softly behind her. "I heard you met with Victoria." "She doesn't like being challenged," she whispered, worry bright in her eyes. "There's more you need to know. Horizon Consulting isn't just a ghost entity, it's part of a larger network with ties to powerful figures outside the company. Victoria and Marcus channel funds through it, and there are rumors of money laundering." A chill climbed James's spine. Bigger than he'd imagined, not just corporate power, but real crime. Sara handed him a small notebook of handwritten entries. "Take this. Dates and amounts that never made it into the system. Use it carefully, and trust no one but Arthur and Eleanor." She left quickly, adding another piece to the puzzle. James spent the night cross-referencing the notebook with the flash drive. An alarming pattern emerged, recurring transfers overseas, always preceded by meetings between Victoria and executives from a competing firm. The next morning, Arthur called, voice weaker than usual. "James, it's getting dangerous. Victoria is rallying her allies on the board. I fear they'll force a no-confidence vote before we can expose the truth." Emotion cracked his words. "You need to move fast. There's a hidden file on the main server. Look for Project Phoenix. It contains recorded meetings that could incriminate them. To access it, you'll need Marcus Thorne's credentials." It sounded impossible. Marcus was careful, his laptop never left his sight. James weighed options, remembering the scrappy hacking skills from his startup days. Not ethical, but necessary. He waited until most employees had left and slipped into Marcus's office. Lights off, computer on, locked screen. He tried common passwords, birthdays, kids' names, no luck. Time bled away until he remembered Eleanor's tip. Marcus was a serious wine collector. James typed the name of a rare vintage Marcus had bragged about in a meeting. The screen unlocked. Heart pounding, he navigated folders until he found an encrypted directory named Phoenix. He plugged in the flash drive and began copying. Every second stretched. Footsteps in the hall. He minimized windows, feigning a casual search as the door opened. Marcus. Surprise flickered across his face. "What are you doing here?" Suspicion edged his voice. James kept his calm. "Looking for older reports to contextualize my analysis." Marcus didn't look convinced, but nodded. "Finish up and go. This isn't a place to linger after hours." When he left, the transfer was complete. At home, James opened the files, audio and video from secret meetings where Victoria and Marcus discussed siphoning funds and plans to push Arthur out. Irrefutable. But one detail chilled him further. Victoria mentioned an external sponsor with government influence. The rot ran beyond the company. Exhausted but resolved, James prepared a dossier for Arthur in the morning. Before sleep could take him, his phone rang. Blocked number, distorted voice. "Stop now, or you and Arthur will pay." Clear enough. They were being watched. He couldn't turn back. Less than 48 hours until the board. He would either present the truth and risk everything, or find a safer way to bring it to light. As the night deepened, he wondered if he had the strength to see it through, or if he'd be one more who fell trying to do the right thing in a world where power writes the rules. Morning seeped in through the blinds of James's apartment, a pale light catching on the anxiety that had kept him awake. Anonymous threats and damning recordings haunted his thoughts like stubborn shadows, each one whispering consequences that could break lives. He stood, heavy with sleeplessness, and stared at the folder of evidence he'd gathered. An arsenal of truth, but to use it, he'd need the courage of a soldier stepping into a minefield. He couldn't act alone. Arthur had to know the latest. He called Eleanor, voice still ragged. "We need to see Arthur. Something urgent." She agreed at once, setting a meeting at a safe location, a private library Arthur used for discreet discussions. Leaving his apartment, James checked if he was being followed. Paranoia had become a companion. The morning fog wrapped San Francisco in secrecy. Every face in the crowd made him flinch. At the library, Arthur was already waiting in a reserved room, surrounded by dark wood shelves that smelled of old paper and secrets. He looked more fragile than ever, but his eyes shone with a fierce resolve. "Tell me everything," he said, hands trembling on the table. James recounted the threat and played the Phoenix recordings. As the audio ran, disgust and anger hardened Arthur's features. "I knew Victoria was ambitious, but this, laundering money, colluding with outsiders. It's a betrayal of everyone who trusted her." He explained that the board meeting had been moved up to late that very day, a gambit by Victoria to catch them unprepared. "We act now," Arthur insisted, voice thin but urgent. "But we can't just show up with these files. Victoria's allies could bury them before anyone sees. We need a strategy." Eleanor suggested James present the findings during the meeting, backed by board members still loyal to Arthur. She named Sarah Lee and another member, Robert Hayes, who had expressed doubts about Atlas. The responsibility pressed hard. He wasn't on the board, just a temp consultant, and facing Victoria on her home turf felt like stepping into a lioness's den. Still, the image of Arthur in the park, vulnerable, grateful, rose up, along with the memory of his own fight to survive. This wasn't just about saving a career. It was about doing what was right where ethics usually bowed to power. He agreed to the plan, but asked Arthur to copy the evidence and secure it in multiple places, including with a trusted attorney. Back at Pendleton Innovations, the air crackled with tension, as if everyone sensed the storm. On his desk, another anonymous note. "Some secrets are better kept. Think of your family." A low blow, his mother in the Midwest. Cold slid through him. He called her at once, making sure she was safe and suggesting she visit a cousin for a few days. She agreed, worried by his tone. He promised to explain soon. With a heavy heart, He prepared for the meeting. He compiled everything into a digital presentation, made physical backups, and sent copies to a few trusted contacts, including an investigative reporter Eleanor knew. He put on his best suit, not as camouflage, but as armor. In the hall, he ran into Sarah. "I'm with you," she whispered. "But be careful. Victoria has surprises." The boardroom was vast and imposing, the conference table a slab of authority. Victoria sat at the head, flanked by Marcus and other allies. Her eyes met James's, disdain flashing before settling into neutrality. Arthur entered moments later, supported by Eleanor, taking his seat with a dignity that hushed the room. Routine updates ticked by, tension drawn tight as wire. When Atlas came up, Victoria delivered her case with unshakable calm: benefits, strategy, growth. Then her move: given Arthur's fragile health and our need for stable leadership, I propose a vote to appoint an interim CEO, effective immediately. Bold. Several heads nodded. James stood. Before any vote, there are critical issues about Atlas that must be addressed. Victoria cut in, sharp. "James, you're a temporary consultant. This is not your place to fling baseless accusations." Arthur's voice steadied the room. "James has the floor. He acts under my direction." James presented the data: suspicious transactions, deleted emails, and finally the Phoenix recordings. As the audio played, silence deepened. Voices of Victoria and Marcus, calmly discussing siphon funds. Faces shifted, from shock to anger. Some of Victoria's allies fidgeted, a few looked away. When he finished, Victoria was pale, fury burning in her eyes. "A fabrication," she snapped. "James Miller is a bitter failure, staging a revenge play." Sarah stood, offering her handwritten ledger, corroborating the findings. Robert Hayes spoke too, questioning Victoria's ethics and calling for an independent investigation. The board split, some defending Arthur, others clinging to Victoria. In the chaos, James's phone buzzed. "Check your email. Urgent." He opened it, another recording, this time Victoria speaking with the external sponsor, mentioning threats against Arthur and James. Someone inside was leaking. But who? The meeting was paused, members drifting into side conversations. Arthur pulled James aside, grave. "This is bigger than we thought. That sponsor has dangerous connections. We need to end this today, or we may not get another chance." Victoria drifted close, voice a venomous whisper. "Think you've won? You just started a war you can't finish. Before day's end, you'll regret crossing me." James held his ground, fear gnawing beneath his ribs. He had exposed the truth, but the fallout was still forming. Back in the room, a vote would soon decide Arthur's future, and the company's. As they waited, he wondered if it was enough, or if unseen forces were already unraveling it. Sunset poured through the windows, throwing long shadows that murmured, "The real fight is just beginning." He drew a breath and braced for whatever came next, knowing the choices made in that room would echo far beyond its walls. The air in the boardroom was so tight with tension it felt like it could be cut. James stayed standing, the weight of every gaze on him, while the board whispered, their faces a blend of disbelief and dread. Arthur stood at his side, silent but steadfast. Across from them, Victoria was motionless, eyes locked on James with a hatred that promised retribution. The recording about the external sponsor had changed the board's temperature. This was no longer just corporate politics. Robert Hayes, one of the most respected members, broke the silence. "We need an immediate, independent investigation. We cannot proceed with any vote until these claims are fully examined." Murmurs of agreement followed, but Victoria wouldn't yield. "This is nonsense," she shouted, rising. "These recordings are fake, and James Miller is Arthur's puppet, grasping at power he's already lost." Then something no one expected. Marcus Thorne stood slowly, pale, hands trembling. "I can't stay silent," he said, voice thin at first, gaining strength. "Victoria's right about one thing, the recordings are real. I was there. Yes, funds were diverted, and yes, the external sponsor exists. What she didn't tell you was that I was coerced. She threatened my family if I wouldn't comply." The words detonated. James watched Victoria's face flicker, from rage to panic. Board members stared, shocked. Marcus went on, laying out how Victoria orchestrated the scheme, using Horizon Consulting to launder money and plotting to remove Arthur to seize full control. He named names, dates, details that matched the evidence James had presented. In a breath, Victoria's loyalties evaporated. Even her closest allies edged away, calculating the odds, and realizing they'd been on the wrong side. Arthur's voice carried, newly authoritative. "Now that the truth is on the record, I move that Victoria Sterling be removed from the board immediately, and that all her recent decisions be reviewed. I also call for a full, transparent investigation." The motion swept the room. Votes that had wavered moments earlier fell in line with Arthur. Victoria was stripped of her position on the spot. Security escorted her out. She paused at the threshold, eyes burning into James. "This isn't over," she hissed. When she was gone, the room exhaled. Attention swung back to Arthur and James, recognition in their faces, something like respect. Robert Hayes proposed appointing James as permanent senior consultant, tasked with overseeing the company's ethical cleanup and implementing transparent practices. Unanimous approval. Relief washed over James, threaded with something steadier, hard-won purpose. He not only saved his career, he'd helped rescue a company from the edge. In the days that followed, Pendleton Innovations entered a season of repair. With James at his side, Arthur led efforts to restore funds, strengthen controls, and rebuild trust. The story reached the press, and James was cast as an unlikely hero, the broke founder who stood up to corporate giants and didn't flinch. His life changed fast, debts cleared, a new path opening. But more important, he'd rediscovered his integrity. Real success, he realized, isn't just profit. It's doing what's right when it's hardest. Grateful, Arthur offered a formal partnership, making James a partner in new philanthropic ventures focused on ethical startups and responsible innovation. James accepted, understanding that his climb from rock bottom had been about more than luck. It had been about resilience and character. Together, he and Arthur became a formidable pair, their bond born from a simple act of kindness in a dark park. The threat of the external sponsor was addressed with authorities, and the investigations led to arrests, closing that shadowed chapter. Safe now, respected, James looked back and saw how every struggle and doubt had shaped him for something larger. He learned that, in the depths of despair, opportunity can rise from the most unlikely places, and that truth, no matter how deeply buried, finds its way to light. The story spread, inspiring others to confront injustice in their own corners of the world. James Miller, the broke founder who saved a billionaire, became a reminder that even in the harshest moments, courage can rewrite destiny. And under the San Francisco sky, a new era began for him, and for everyone he touched, an era where ethics and humanity stand tall, proving that the most shocking choices can spark the most beautiful transformations. If this story moved you, imagine what can happen when you choose courage in your own life. Tap the video on screen to discover more true stories of transformation, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an update. Your support helps us keep sharing narratives that inspire and change lives.